Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the special transmission on Budget 2022-2023. We'll be talking about the salient features of this budget and how the effects of it on people. Of course, it seems to be a people-friendly budget, also tax-friendly. We'll be talking about whether it's exports-driven, whether, also for the lower classes. Also, it seems for the incentives for industrialists, also as far as agriculture is concerned, some of the major tax rebates are concerned. Overall, the effects of it on the people below poverty line in terms of the incentives the government has offered, all of that today. We'll be talking about all of that, some of the particular measures the government has in mind, also the effects as the government sees that will trickle down in this fiscal year. I have with me Ariba Shahid, who is an economist. Thank you so much for being with us today. We also have with us Dr. Waqar, who is Executive Director, STPI. Thank you for being with us. Ariba, as far as overall this budget is concerned, as you must have seen, heard the speech of the Finance Minister also. How do you see it overall? What are some of the features, main salient features you feel will have an overall effect on inflation also and will trickle down to the lower classes particularly?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So what was interesting for the budget this year is that Mifta Ismail, while presenting it, talked about sustainable growth and how important it is considering how Pakistan, when it hits 5 to 6% growth, it's mostly import driven. It impacts the current account deficit significantly, which adds pressure onto the rupee, which further goes on to a whole cycle, which adds to like imported inflation in the sense of a depreciated rupee. So that was really interesting to note that the government is now trying to think beyond import-led growth or consumption-driven growth. So that was great. On the other hand, in terms of inflation, we all have realized that inflation is a tough cookie to tackle in this point of time. Considering that the budget was made with the estimates of inflation being around between 11 to 12%, this is a little unlikely in this scenario. However, the fact that the income slabs were increased for income taxes, where now people earning more than 100,000 are now applicable to pay taxes on their salaries. That is a welcome reform as well. So, in considering the tough times that we have, considering how we need to jack up revenues, considering that the reserves are dwindling, in such a time, seeing a somewhat people-friendly budget is a concern at this point, because what does this mean? Does this mean there are more mini budgets to come? Considering the IMF program at hand, the budget seems people-friendly, but the question is, will we be able to implement it?
Right, let me come back to you. I'm going to go to Dr. Waqar. Dr. Waqar, is it true that, in terms of inflation also, in terms of, as Ariba explained it, do you think that overall this will target inflation? Because, in terms of even as far as inflation is concerned, we also saw that according to what was said in the speech, it seems to be down from what 13% earlier on to about 11 some percent. Do you think that this budget targets that also?
Yes, thank you very much. I think I agree with Ariba's overall analysis. There is an intent of the government to really go after inflation, particularly inflationary impact on the poorest of the poor segment, of course. But I think one of the things which still needs to be seen is whether the measures which have been described in the budget to bring down inflation to 11 odd percent, will this be agreed by the fund? Because some of these measures may be resisted, including, for example, the provision of subsidies, rather expansion in subsidies, which of course has been presented in the budget. Of course, it's pro-poor, but one still would like to know if this has been agreed with the fund program as well. Second, I think apart from, of course, a focus on the poor, there is a cognizance that one has to also bring down the cost of doing business. And therein, I feel that the budget has tried to help the self-employment sector, and there are initiatives to bring down cost of business for small businesses, particularly small retailers, whose transactions cost of tax liability or direct tax burden has been reduced to some extent. In fact, the tax liability will come as part of the electricity bill, and it will be full and final. So that's heartening to see that there is a revived social contract with the with the taxpayers. Thirdly, I thought that, of course, one of the ways to relieve the pressure on the poorest segment is through, of course, the food prices. And therein, of course, there's an effort that somehow agricultural prices should be stabilized. The reliance on imported food or agricultural items, and given that their prices directly impact the local prices, that reliance should be reduced, if not in the short term, then at least in the medium term. And then, of course, those who are in the small-scale farm sector, their energy needs, of course, have to be subsidized. But that room for subsidizing isn't there. So one sees that the trade taxes on solar panels have been reduced, and there would be some increase in credit to the small farmers.
Dr. Waqar, overall, when the budget, we saw when the government came in the kind of overall climate that it came in, there's been a lot of emphasis on economy. There has been a lot of emphasis on the government grappling with trying to get to a point where there can be some sort of, balance between what the government can give to the people and what it can actually do, considering what the IMF has also said and considering their conditionalities also. In terms of that balance, do you think that this budget has reached that kind of balance in terms of what it can translate to the people and also to satisfy, like you said, the conditionalities that IMF may have?
Yeah, I think the intent is there. There are areas in the budget which are ambitious, but at the same time, if one looks at the data, the government seems to be clear, at least in their own minds, that it is going to be an uphill task. For example, the inflation rate for the next year, the targeted inflation rate is still in the double digits, which to many like myself may seem unambitious, but that's probably the current state of the story, because inflation, of course, will remain a function of internal, but more importantly, external factors as well. So given the global uncertainty, it seems that the government is expecting inflation to remain high, which has been reflected in the budget.
Right, let me come back to you. We have with us Rana Ihsan Abdul Khan from the PMLN. Thank you for joining us. Rana Sahab, as far as, we've been speaking about this before also, as far as the challenges are concerned, economy, we saw recently Shehbaz Sharif Sahab even, say time and again that there should be a charter of economy, considering the kind of situation that the government is grappling with and overall the country is seeing. How challenging, let me start off by asking you, how challenging was it to come up with these measures, considering the situation we're in, considering again the balance that needs to be there between what can, the burden that people can realistically bear and what the IMF conditionalities will likely impose on people?
Thank you so much. Not an easy scenario in which to give a budget and to appease the population of Pakistan, but we have tried to make a balance between giving relief to the people who deserve it most and, having fiscal discipline, which did not exist in the current financial year, and to, bring back the deficits into something which is manageable. So, one thing, the targets we've set for current account deficit is 2% of GDP. We think that the export target that we've set is achievable. We need to bring down the imports. That is what we plan to do. Similarly, the fiscal discipline that was required, and it was also being watched very closely by the international lending institutes, and it was around 8.5% for this financial year. So we plan to bring the fiscal deficit down under 5%. And similarly, we have planned to raise the taxes by 20%. And we feel it is achievable, and we've targeted sectors which were not taxed. For example, the traders, bringing them in a fixed tax regime. Similarly, targeting the sectors which have high profits, the banking sector. We've increased the tax rate on their profits, on their income. So almost 75% of the new tax initiatives are, on towards direct taxation and towards the higher income groups. So we have tried to give relief to the salaried class by increasing the slab of from 600,000 to 1.2 million. So
that I want to talk more about that. Let me. I will just go to Ariba and then ask you again. Ji, Ariba, do you agree in terms of what the budget offers to the salaried class? There is, of course, we've also seen an increase that the government about 15%, if I'm not wrong. There is, to give the kind of incentives that one needs, and also to the lower income groups, as I understand it, there are also intense, incentives there also. Overall, do you think that this will be sufficient for people to in terms of how challenging now the situation is, considering inflation and all of that, these incentives will make a difference?
So the 15% increase in salaries of government employees is a good initiative in the sense that it gives off a signal to not only the provincial assemblies but also to the private sector to follow suit and to increase salaries in line with inflation. So 15% is a good take. And in terms of the salary class, like the increase of the slab from 600,000 to 1.2 million, that is also a good step. What it does is it increases your real income in terms of how much you take home. So that's also a really good step in an effort to help the salary class. Another really good point in the budget is the fact that they're trying to tax the real estate sector. Again, this is the second attempt at doing this, but that is also a really good attempt, because not only does that help you tax out a segment that is widely untaxed, but it also helps bring in the richer people into the tax net and pay their fair duty, so that people who struggle to make ends meet do not have to face more indirect taxes and proportionally higher regressive taxes on themselves. So that's a really good take on their part as well.
Okay,
yeah.
We'll talk more about this. I'm going to go to Dr. Waqar. Dr. Waqar, in terms of how it deals, in terms of business also, that's been something that's been, something on the agenda as far as the government is concerned. Again and again, the Prime Minister has also said that, they want to give incentives to the industrial sector. Does the budget do that?
Yes, I think to some extent, there is a realization that growth which has been achieved, it needs to be consolidated. And the fact that the government may not be able to do so from the import side, there have to be some internal measures which allow the government to consolidate growth, at least in sectors which have witnessed gains in the past 1 year. So one sees some decent gains in export-oriented sector, and Finance Minister particularly mentioned textile and garment sector in his speech, and one feels that facilitation to this sector will continue during the next fiscal year as well. But then there are a host of exemptions from general sales tax which have been allowed to inputs of agriculture sector particularly, but also some SMEs sectors as well, including, for example, construction and allied sectors. In agriculture, for example, one sees that government intends to reduce the reliance on import of edible oil and the likes, and due to which the GST on agricultural implements has been reduced.
Right. Let me come back to you. I'm going to go to Rana Ehsan ji. Rana sir, overall, what are, in terms of the last budget, how would you compare it? And, what are some of the areas that were not targeted, that were in terms of taxes, in terms of other, initiatives, in terms of how facilitating people that you feel that this budget has and you've done, the changes you feel?
Well, the last budget was expansionary, and we saw that with that expansionary budget, and what the PTI government did was, they gave their input into inflation, and they actually played a part in that inflation by the government spending they were doing, and it seemed like it was an election budget, and that is what they were calling. Whereas this budget has set the growth target, which is around 5%. So we feel that this is the time to give the economy, to consolidate the economy, to make sure that our current account deficits are under control, that the requirement of dollars for this economy is sustainable. So we're looking into a sustainable growth model, whereas the last budget was, it was more elaborative, and it was more towards, it seemed that it was an election budget. So that is one big difference that I feel is between this budget and that budget. And then, bringing down the fiscal deficit from 8.5% to under 5%, bringing down the current account deficit from 5% of GDP to almost 2%. So these targets are all focused towards sustainability. And bringing the country out of the macroeconomic instability that we are currently, in. So similarly, we feel that we would also want to control the circular debt. That is something which needs to be checked on. So all of these are tough decisions. But similarly, we have focused on targeted subsidies. That has been the main focus of this budget, be it BISP, be it, giving relief in terms of petrol increases to cover that up. So the youth program is quite elaborative. It is quite, ambitious. So all these things are to basically help the lower income segment from the, inflationary trends, which are mostly happening due to the international commodity price increases. And we feel that once this is done, this budget is...
What about growth? There's a lot that is being said by the PTI in terms of, their government's growth, and, they're saying it was more than 15%. How would you answer that?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
In terms of growth, there's a lot that the last government is saying in terms of their growth of in the last fiscal year. They're saying they didn't do they did quite well, and the numbers at this time. Would you agree with that? Do you think that that's an accurate?
Well, they have achieved a growth rate of 5.97%. That is what is clear.
Sorry, 5.9%.
But that growth rate comes with a current account deficit, which is unsustainable, and it comes with a balance of payment crisis, which has led to Pakistan, going towards IMF program, which was on a delay. And this growth has led to a fiscal deficit, which is 8.5%. So it is, and this growth has led to your circular debt increasing unprecedentedly, and you have now, even in the gas sector, you have losses. So this growth rate, which has been achieved, has come at a very high cost. And we feel that the economy needs a growth which is sustainable, which is long-term, which you have to make a balance with the current account crisis, with the balance of payment crisis, with your fiscal discipline. So I think, any government can push in and get a growth rate, but then if you have all these crises coming in, which can really impact the future of your economy, or the sustainability of the economy, I think that cost is too high to pay for such a growth.
Ariba, would you agree with that? Do you think that, in terms of the growth rate that is being, of course, 5.9% that the last government is talking about has come at a huge cost, which is what Rana Saab is saying. And, in terms of what incentives does the budget offer, particularly, let's talk about agriculture, for example.
So I absolutely agree with Dr. Saab. Dr. Waqar is absolutely right. The previous growth that we've witnessed is at a cost of our future development as well, because the boom bust cycle, we've hit the boom and now we're heading towards the bust. So we keep overheating the economy, which is fueled through increased current account deficits, because most of the things that fuel our growth are through imports. So that is one issue that we have. And he's absolutely right. And in terms of that, this budget seems not as contractionary as one would have hoped or one would have thought it would be. But that is also an attempt to mitigate the impact on the common folk. So there's that. But at this
In
point in
terms of,
time,
let's talk about agriculture particularly, because we know that, we've seen that as far as the government is concerned, it wants to focus on industrialization, it wants to focus on, giving as much rebates as it can realistically to businesses, to, have as far as FDI is concerned, and we've had comments on that time and again. We've also had them say that, as far as agriculture is concerned, it's been an ignored sector and they want to, give incentives there also. What has the government done in that area in particular?
so for this particular budget, the government has announced 21 billion to enhance production of crops and livestock. And the minister says that the Ministry of Food and Security has prepared a 3-year growth strategy in collaboration with the Planning Commission as well. So that's a good omen. That's a good omen to see, because the government says that they are aimed at increasing agri production and making farmers prosperous and promoting a smart agriculture development in the country. So we're trying to move beyond traditional conventional agriculture and towards smart and more sustainable, but also more productive agriculture. So that's a good policy take on from the government, and that's a decent amount of budgeted revenue towards it.
Right. Dr. Vakar, what about industry, the industrial sector particularly, in terms of tax rebates?
Yes, I think first and foremost, there's a welcome announcement by the finance minister that the refunds of the export sector would be expedited. And of course, we do understand that for some, these refunds have been stuck for not just for months, but for years. So I think that's welcome news, and that should help with the liquidity, help with the working capital, which of course they would be in dire need of. Second, there was a mention in the budget documents that there had been some news that probably there may be curbs on export financing, but the government has said that they will try their best to make available or at least let concessional export financing stay. I believe that this should at least allow our industrial sector to really reorient away from focusing just on the domestic industries or industries whose supplies are directed towards local consumption, but towards export orientation and towards supplying to global buyers. And I think this will also help Pakistan integrate in global value chains.
In terms of how it will translate to, income groups below the poverty line, how do you think it will make a difference in the kind of incentives that the government has offered?
I think for that group, probably two areas are important. One, of course, is the transfers that have to go to them in the form of Benazir income support program, in the form of enhanced allocation for Baitul Mal. And of course, there is some cushion available with the Ministry of Food Security now to also help with smoothing of food consumption. But then, of course, there are limits to how much the government can help the small-scale operators on the self-employment side and the low-income group in the wage employment side. And I think this is where the private sector, or allowing the cost of doing business to at least go down in the medium term for the private sector, should help. We need to give them probably a lead for creating more jobs, and with jobs, of course, would then, of course, job creation has a direct impact on poverty reduction. And that is the channel that probably government is trying to follow. They would like to see some reduction in unemployment, because according to the estimate presented, around 4.5 million people have seen unemployment in the past year or so. I think the government would like to reverse this situation.
Okay, let me go to Ariba. Ariba, do you agree in terms of how the budget deals with below income poverty groups particularly? Do you agree with Dr. Vakar?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Dr. Vakar. But I also feel that, considering the inflation trajectory that we're witnessing, and considering the fact that global commodity prices are not going to be coming down anytime soon, and the enthusiastic PDL, Petroleum Development Levy targets that the government has set, I also feel that the lower income class should brace themselves for a significantly higher inflation rate going forward. because in the past the government targeted 650 billion last year in terms of PDL revenue. They were not even halfway near it. This year the government targeted around 710 billion, if I'm not wrong. Um,
Yes.
and that would require the government to excessively increase the petrol prices for the country and charge like the maximum petroleum levy. Unless the prices go down, I do not see inflation tapering down. So
Okay.
this, while the budget is being as accommodating as possible for the lower income groups, this will prove to be a challenge in absence of public transport in the country, in absence of adequate public transport in the country.
Right, let me go to Dr. Vakar. Dr. Vakar, what about the manufacturing and mining? We've also seen some incentives in that area, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, I think in the mining sector, of course, there was a delegation that met the Prime Minister earlier this week from Balochistan. And mining sector was, of course, discussed. And in the special package, which is being designed for Balochistan, it is expected that mining will be one of the priority sectors over there. But of course, apart from this vertical transfer to Balochistan, it is expected that there will be further announcements for this sector in the provincial budget as well, of both Khyber Pakhtunkhwa as well as Balochistan. But one needs to wait for that. But of course, there are other linked industries in the primary sector which are hopefully going to gain. For example, many of the raw material supplies of this sector, particularly the primary sector in the oil and gas sector, have been insulated from trade taxes. Many of the CPEC-related investments which are taking place, they will also be allowed some tax exemption or preferential tax arrangement. And of course, those CPEC projects or FDI-related projects have backward linkages with local industries, so that cascading may also be seen in the coming days. But one has to be mindful that given the current resource constraints, there's very limited options with the government to move forward in direct assistance to the industry. What the government may aim to do is to package some product in public sector development program, PSDP, for select primary industries, including the mining sector perhaps. But PSDP itself at $800 billion, with majority going to sectors such as the National Highways Authority, there's limited space for other or non-conventional sectors to be supported, at least this year.
In terms of, when we talk about a 30% tax, as far to the income class is concerned, that, as I understand it, has also been brought down?
Yes, I think while that has been brought down, one has to understand that in real terms, perhaps, the effect may not be too much. However, where I think the government has tried to lower the tax burden is to increase the threshold level from 4 lakhs to 6 lakhs. I think that may have a greater impact on the lower and lower middle income groups going forward. But progressivity overall.
But doesn't that also mean that they, whether the 30% will translate, like you said, it might not make a huge difference to income taxpayers, and also there's a difference between filers and non-filers also? Yeah.
You see, the reason I was making the earlier point was because for most of the salaried class, there is this arrangement of withholding of tax. So that withholding of tax under current times acts as an indirect tax, and in overall terms, it is inflationary, of course. But of course, given the current revenue constraints of the government, they will have to do that. But on your other points, I think on the overall progressivity of tax, there are certain measures which could have been taken. There is an almost 2.5 to 3 trillion rupees of tax gap, which could have been tapped. I do read the arguments by those who are saying that the current FDR target is too ambitious, but I am in the other camp which believes that far more tax effort is required by FBR under current circumstances.
Right, let me go to Ariba. Ariba, as far as, are you also in the same camp as Dr. Waqar on considering that we need to perhaps make more effort as far as FBR is concerned? Because of course there are two opinions on that.
Well, of course, the FBR needs to do more in terms of jacking up tax collections. There need to be more creative, innovative ways in order to make sure tax is not regressive and it falls onto the people that need to pay it more, so that we don't need to rely on indirect taxes. So I definitely agree with Dr. Waqar on the fact that there is a need for more, especially if we want to bridge the fiscal deficit anytime soon.
Overall, as far as food items are concerned, as far as essentials are concerned, do you see those coming down at all in terms of prices?
So it generally depends on the country of origin for these products. So for instance, if the products are imported, for example, cooking oil, I do not see the prices coming down until they come down in the international market. And also until there is no adequate stock or supply ensured, we can't be sure, because in the past we have seen cost push inflation driven by artificial shortages in the country. So you can never be too sure about that. So this is more of a matter of governance and also a matter of how we hedge ourselves against international prices. So what this also means is that the government needs to look into hedging. The government needs to look into different ways in which it can mitigate the international commodity prices as well.
We've also seen the government cut down on a lot of expenditure. Isn't that true in this budget particularly?
So austerity has been a theme since the past 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years. Austerity has been a theme, especially in a country where you've got dwindling reserves. Austerity does make sense. This budget doesn't seem to be too frivolous in terms of expenditure, in terms of salary hikes or etc. It doesn't seem to be frivolous with money. So you are right about that. And also the government does seem to be taking a little more of a tough stance on the rich in terms of the fact that taxes over 1,600cc cars are increased, taxes on cigarettes are increased, pensioner taxes reduced, things of the sort have happened, taxes, super tax imposed on banks. So it has shown that they are trying to be tougher on the segment that can afford it and not the segment that cannot afford it.
Okay. Dr. Waqar, does it, in your opinion, what are some of the sectors you feel perhaps, could have been, the government could have been perhaps more, hard on, so to speak, and, as far as tax is concerned, and perhaps given more in other areas overall?
Yeah, I believe that the times we are passing from currently really calls for some hard decisions, The kind of decisions we had made when, for example, Pakistan had faced the floods of 2010, we imposed instruments like super taxes on the rich, on financial sector companies, on the banks, for example. I think the government has tried to go that way, but then stopped going that extra mile where, for example, super taxes, extra taxes with sunset clause could have been introduced. I believe that if government had gone that way, most of the sectors or most of the stakeholders even may have agreed even for a limited period, at least the super rich. There was a consensus that, and it's a global consensus, it's not just in
For example, what are some of the measures you feel they could have taken, even if you look at the super rich, like you're saying? You're saying they should have been taxed more?
I was expecting the banking sector entities, the insurance entities, other conventional financial sector institutions to perhaps face, at least in a progressive manner, higher incidence of taxes. While the rate may have increased, but overall structure of tax hasn't changed for them.
Don't you think that maybe the government has tried to strike a balance and keep everyone as satisfied or happy, perhaps is not the right word. I'll go to Ariba on this and, sort of ease into it at the same time, trying to satisfy IMF also and trying to take those difficult decisions.
So if we were to sum this up, the general take for the economy is the budget's a neutral budget. It's not a very positive budget. It's not a very negative budget. If we look at
Okay.
it sector-wise, it's negative for banks. It's neutral to positive for the cement sector. It's neutral for fertilizer, neutral for power, negative for the automobile sector, negative to positive for the steel sector, positive for the textile sector, negative for chemicals, positive for gas, utilities, and positive for entertainment. So
Okay.
overall, the budget is somewhat neutral. I wouldn't say it's pro people or pro business, but I wouldn't say it's anti people, anti business. But
Okay.
considering the IMF, breathing down our necks at this point in time, I feel that it should have been a little more, um, it should have been a little more contractionary, in order for the IMF to negotiate well with us.
Could you explain that a little bit more?
So the IMF wants the country to take a few tough stances in terms of revenue, and in terms of how contractionary or how expansionary the government is. And
Okay.
expansionary policy is out of the question at the moment because the IMF will not give you money to be frivolous, and it wants to be as prudent with the money and as show as much austerity as possible. So at this point in time, I'm pretty sure that the IMF, seeing this budget, would go back and be like, you know what, do more. This is not enough. This is not enough to get the approval for the next tranche.
Okay. Dr. Vakar, do you agree? You think that it could have been, perhaps harder? I think you also mentioned on the super rich. But in terms of particular sectors, like, Ariba said, she summed it up very well. She said, textile is a positive. There are other areas which are negative, but overall it seems to be, not too bad, one can say, considering the circumstances that we're in. It leaves room for more measures the government can take which are pro-people, pro-friendly in the course of the year, of course.
No, that's right. But I think whatever the government wants to take in the course of the year should be packaged within the Finance Act. It's never a good practice to resort to mini budgets. And I'm sure that the government would not go that way. Even if they do, that won't be a deliberate effort, I'm hoping. But we did see, for example, this practice in the past of supplementary finance bills to appease certain quarters.
But one doesn't expect that to happen as far, at this time, certainly. But, I'm going to, Ariba, your quick comments overall, summing up, we are, out of time. But, I'd like your overall comments on this budget.
Honestly, my honest take is that you can come up with a budget, but then later on the year you come up with mini budgets. We've seen this happen in the past, and it may not be the last time a mini budget has come out. So going forward, considering the transitionary stage of the government, and we may see another mini budget coming up, and we may see some trouble with the IMF, but only time will tell. So far, the budget does not seem bad for the people. And it's an attempt at being as friendly as possible given the circumstances.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being with us. Ariba Shahid, Dr. Vakar, thank you for joining us. Rana Ehsan Afzal Khan, thank you for being with us. Certainly, as far as the budget is concerned, it seems to be a pro-people budget. It seems to be balanced. It seems to be people-friendly. It also seems at this time to give incentives to the different sectors, some of them being, of course, and also seems to give rebates as far as poverty stricken class is concerned. It's at all of that certainly seems to be the priority as far as the government is concerned. Of course, we'll know more in the next couple of days on what the government plans to do. Thank you so much for being with us today and joining us.